Good morning, everybody. It's April 15th, 2022. I'm Charlie Fink with Ted Schilowitz and our guest, Mike Boland. It's This Week in XR. And man, what a week it is, Ted.
Morning, Mike. Morning, Charlie. Nice to have the three of us to talk this week because it was a very active week across the sectors, right? So lots to go through. You've got a laundry list, Charlie.
I know. Should we start with Elon Musk, Mike?
Sure. But the crazy thing about this week, just while we're talking about the activity levels, it was kind of a departure from the bearish state of 2022 we've seen so far with, public and private market investment valuations. If you were to squint your eyes this week, it was like it was a year ago.
Right. We're partying like it's 2021.
There you go.
Every like 18 months, we have one of these moments, right? Where everything sort of coalesces and people do realize that there's lots of forward momentum going in here, and then lots of dollars start to get kind of reactivated and re-energized. And sometimes it just all happens in 1 week, kind of like this week, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
The momentum for this thing, even though nobody knows what it is quite incredible. And I guess my question is it, converging is this what Web3 means, where crypto and VR and spatial computing and mobile and the digital twin of the real world just gets into one giant cultural mashup that can never be disentangled?
Yeah, right. Converging or coalescing maybe is the right sort of terminology, where the investment community, the various business sectors are all realizing there is a there, and it's going to be even bigger than anybody sort of anticipated, but there's still a lot of jockeying, right? I mean, Mike, you track this all the time, and there's going to be still a lot of fallout, a lot of people that think they've got it right that won't get it right?
I think that's a key point when we're looking at this, the thing that we're all sort of calling the M word, or the things that are all converging, all those moving parts you guys just mentioned that are converging into Web3 or the M word. I believe, like a lot of people do, that we're in somewhat of a bubble. And that's not to say, when people point out the word bubble, usually it's taken as like, this is all a bunch of BS. And I don't think that's the case. There's definitely a there. But I think that, there's a bit, it's the pendulum swing. It's the overexcitement on the sort of buy side of the, investment markets that will sort of reach a correction at some point. But then rising from those ashes will be something meaningful. And that's exactly the pattern we keep seeing. We saw, that pattern defines the early 2000s .com bubble that ended up being, as or more meaningful than all the irrational exuberance had projected at the time. But it just ended up being something that was slightly different than all those visions. And it just took a lot longer. So I think we're probably in some of those early stages of that. Just like, that's not a new concept. It's the typical sort of pendulum swing, the hype cycle and all that. But I think that's where we are now. So all of that investment this week, could just be part of that, figuring out what's going on, jockeying for positioning, as you said, Ted.
Why don't you kick through them, Charlie, since we talked in scope and people were like, so what were they, right? What
Well, of course. Well, first of all, Epic Games raised another $2 billion.
Right. $2 billion with a B. Yeah.
With a B. At a $31.5 billion valuation, which is what Unity is valued at in the public markets. So there's an IPO afoot here, maybe next year.
Right.
And so Sony wants to get their, 30% premium or whatever it is from being so deeply in bed with Epic Games, and Epic Games wants cash. So it was this rather high valuation given the revenue of the company, but it's just on a growth trajectory that is like Google or Amazon like. So I think anybody who can get into it now is really getting in on the ground floor of what could be a major metaverse platform.
And how much do we think of that monstrous investment has to do with this Lego verse that is part of that?
Well, clearly there was some kind of love-in with Epic and the family behind both Lego and the investment fund.
Yep.
So, the brand thing was kind of a big nothing burger. Lego is, on Unity, in the Unity store also for free. So obviously they've been promoting spatial Legos. It's actually a great idea because isn't that just Minecraft?
They're blocks.
So Lego has lots of ways that it can go in developing them. And okay, so Unreal will be the platform. So that wasn't much of an announcement, but this puts it into context, right? Yeah. Oh, now I understand why there's a major initiative at Epic, which has a lot of fish to fry for Lego.
Yeah, and
So,
when we
I mean, again, huge brand with unlimited potential, but obviously Epic is involved with some very big things now. The Epic, they just released Unreal Engine 5, which has the potential to empower a kind of cloud streaming of photorealistic games, which is, I think, what everybody is starting to feel the ground trembling with that a little bit, following, the cloud services, the cloud gaming services, also are going to put the game console business in a tailspin. And, the game console business is kind of stalled because of the supply chain issue is very real for them because they need cheap parts, and that just ain't happening anymore. So it's kind of, again, this convergence of the competition and the difficulty in sustaining their business plan, which, consistent theme of ours, Ted, is made of atoms. And what you want is a business comprised of bits.
Right, which is something we always keep going back to, is all of the success across the enterprise sectors and the business sectors and the heavy light industry sectors that are really driving the real economy underneath all this, right? And the sort of consumer layer, to Mike's point, it's in that sort of frothy, bubbly kind of, it will find its way, but it's going to find its way in very interesting, unknown ways, right? Over the next 5-7 years, kind of, to define it.
So for Epic, I think this makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense for its investors too, because we talk about all those moving parts and we talk about how there's going to be sort of a stack required for whatever this thing becomes that we call the metaverse. It's going to need connectivity. It's going to need infrastructure. It's going to need content, an identity layer, all of these sort of things, right? The stack. And I think at the center of all that are going to be game engines. And I think that Epic and Unreal Engine is probably best positioned. Unreal Engine 5, you can tell they're really going at growth markets in, Hollywood production in addition to games, because of course they have, a lot of market share in games, but a growth area is going to be cinematic production. So I think the interesting thing is what they're going to do with that money next. I think that they're probably going to make a lot of acquisitions to accelerate that path. They've already accelerated some content studios and gaming studios like Harmonix. They bought
Sketchfab.
There you go.
Volumetric photography catches on. Sketchfab has, again, the potential to be, I don't know, a giant YouTube-like platform for volumetric content.
Yeah. And I wonder, with all this money, if they don't go out and buy like a small Hollywood production studio for that vertical integration and get a toehold there.
It's possible. I mean, the entertainment business continues its consolidation and its transformation from, a company that distributes something to physical theaters rather than something that's continuously streaming, entertainment onto devices. So, along these lines, there's a company called Genies. We were green rooming this, Ted.
Yes.
That just raised $150 million and a $1 billion valuation. This is their second round of funding, following $65 million last year. They make NFTs for Universal Music and Warner Brothers Music. They're their official NFT partner. I mean, what does that even mean?
I'll ask you guys, what does it even mean, right? I mean, I think they're defining what it means, but the big sort of buzz around this, and correct me if I'm wrong, because there are two genies floating around in the Genieverse. So we have to define what they two are, but this is the one you're referring to that Bob Iger just joined the board of a couple of weeks ago, right? And I think that set the stage for his post-Disney, what he's going to do world, and a belief structure about this digital entertainment transformation that he's been in for many generations, finding those new moments where he wants to sort of take something on. And I think it was a sort of a bold step, right? So you guys probably have some thoughts about that.
Mike, jump in here.
Yeah, I think that there's still this big missing piece when it comes to avatar systems. And it's one of those pieces of that stack that I referred to earlier. It's a key piece, but there's just like this big question mark of all of these avatar systems keep coming out and there's fragmentation and they're all claiming that their avatars are going to be universal. Mm-hmm. And that's the key word, and the interoperability that everyone's talking about that's going to really tie a lot of this together. But I don't see how that's going to happen when you have the Unreal Engines of the world and other publishers and platforms. They're the ones who get to decide what different sort of software works on their systems when it comes to a compatible avatar system. Will my avatar look the way it's supposed to when I show up in Fortnite versus some other sort of virtual experience?
And we talk about
you're not gonna show up in Horizon Worlds looking like your Call of Duty avatar.
Yeah, right. I mean, there's stylistic differences. But yes, sorry, go on.
No, so we talk about this all the time. I mean, the idea of the walled garden effect, right? And how high are those walled gardens? And, so we're using a Zoom client to do our podcast every week. And we couldn't very easily just bring in another guest via FaceTime, right? Or Google or Google Meet or Microsoft Teams. It's just not going to happen, right? Not even with the aspirations of maybe it would be nice for it to happen, just the technical underpinnings and who's going to pay for the cost of that tunneling and all of that work, right?
Yeah.
So there is this belief structure, this kind of theoretical, kind of, socialistic conceptual belief structure that we can make this harmonious connectivity between all these different privatized companies that all have profit motives to keep you in their world, not other people's worlds. But I think the three of us have a pretty realistic take on it that's just not really going to happen.
And that's the challenge. The vested interests involved aren't interested in all coming to the table and saying, yeah, let's all just be interoperable, which if you look at the web today, it predated all of these tech giants that have such sway. Right now, going into this next era, they have the ability, and Facebook is trying to, or Meta is trying to, sway it in its direction. And we're going to see a lot of that. So that's sort of like web-like interoperability and standards, I think is the key we all keep talking about, but like there are major forces probably preventing that from happening, to your point, Ted.
Yeah, I mean, the counter argument, which is sort of an interesting thing for the three of us to debate, is if we look at email as an example, right? Email is highly interoperable. Right? So, everybody's got different email monikers.
Well, and so are web pages.
And web pages are highly interoperable.
And HTML, so it can be searched.
HTTPS,
and then clicked on.
standard.
That's my crazy misunderstanding about virtual land, right? I mean, aren't I just going to go to whatever web presence you have via hyperlink like I would today?
Yeah.
I mean, why would you being on a particular platform or you being next door to Snoop Dogg matter to me?
Right.
I'm going to Ted's house, not Snoop Dogg's house.
Right.
Yeah.
Because there's an artificial construct that companies are trying to monetize on, which is virtual land is real, therefore you can't just hop from place to place. So they're trying to hold on to that, but that may be
but they'll hold on to that for people who want to go to social worlds like that.
Yeah.
So it's
a full circle to avatars. One of the ways this could work at just like a 40,000 foot level, I always look at the way that emoji currently work. It's based on Unicode, which is
it's funny. I thought the same thing.
It's a universal thing. So if I'm on WhatsApp and I text you on iMessage with a little, smile wink emoji or thumbs up or whatever it is, it actually shows up. It's stylized slightly differently because each of those platforms has their own look and feel, but it's still, for the most part, the sort of Unicode that translates. So some version of that might need to be the way that avatars go sort of cross worlds.
I think that Unreal is going to have a lot to say about this. I mean, they've introduced metahumans, which is sort of a very smart way to do what everybody does the minute they make their first avatar, which is it's an idealized version of you, a younger, fitter, hairier version of you. And I think that's going to be very powerful. And so they may be able to set a standard using that as a plugin, like, okay, you can put in meta avatars or Ready Player Me or whatever you want, but here's our default photorealistic idealized avatar that's much easier to use than all the rest of them because it's part of the platform.
But they're the ones who are going to decide that, not these companies that are getting funded that are the actual avatar, the genie of the world.
Although, there's one company in here that we're ignoring. They just raised $14 million at the same time. So it obviously has kind of been drowned out, but in many ways is cooler. And I encourage you to look at the video in the Forbes column today. It's a company called The Fabricant.
Yeah.
And they allow you to make bespoke fashion from templates. So they've got a fashion designer who's making a template that looks pretty good, but then you can put animation on it. All sorts of, stylize it in all sorts of ways that are bespoke. And then presumably it becomes an NFT that gets somehow magically attached to whatever avatar system you're using, or you'll use a specific avatar system, which allows you to wear the costumes that you make. I mean, but it would be pretty incredible if you could do that and then take that costume to VR chat and show it off.
Yeah, and how atomized do we get here? Because we're talking about
Timing is
personalized
everything, right?
avatars. Now we're talking about the actual accoutrement. I mean, it's it's going to.
Oh, look, and there's, I mean, a digital pets company came
Yep.
along,
Yeah.
and now let me shift gears to AR.
Well, first with the pets thing, really quick. I was joking yesterday that if we are indeed in a bubble, is this the pets.com of this
Right.
bubble?
Exactly.
And the NFT.
I think this
NFT
is a relatively small company from Israel that I just stuck in here because I think on the heels of these other NFT stories, it was, oh, why not?
Yeah.
For me, the two moments of like, this is the beginning of the end, Mike, was the NFT pet and the NFT McRib.
Yeah, there you go.
McRib. When those hit the radar, I was like, okay, this is it.
We jumped the shark.
We jumped the shark, exactly.
So, well, here's something that I think has not jumped the shark: TikTok.
Mm.
And they
And
did two
the
very
AR
good things
now.
this week that, again, kind of got drowned out. Otherwise, it'd be the top story we were talking about. Because, first of all, they've introduced Effects House. And Mike, why don't you take this one? Because I think this was the topic of your column this week.
Yeah. So I've been saying for a while that TikTok is sort of the sleeping giant of AR. And it's not a sleeping giant, broadly speaking. It has 1 billion global users. But in AR, its efforts are a little bit underbaked relative to, a company like Snap. And so where it sat up till this week was actually where before it launched Lens Studio. And as we've learned from that, an open developer platform is jet fuel for any AR play. Because what Snap has been able to do there is, they've crowdsourced all of this lens creation. They've incentivized all that creation. So then all of these lenses get created. It then attracts users, which, have deeper engagement and in larger numbers, which attracts more developers. And it's sort of that classic flywheel effect. And then you get to 6 billion lens plays per day, which is what Snap's at now. And all those big numbers attract the real end game, which is brand advertisers advertising on the platform. So there's a real business outcome that traces back to that initial move, which is to create this open developer platform. So I think that's significant in what TikTok has done now, which is Effect House, which is essentially their Lens Studio. It actually is very similar in a lot of ways. So it's going to depend if they can execute as well as Snap has, but the pieces are in place for them to now go into hyperdrive in scaling the actual lens creation by crowdsourcing it.
I think TikTok is killing it right now. So this is just, as you said, Mike, that has potential jet fuel to pull people away from other platforms, as Facebook admitted that they were. And you have to believe that if Facebook is feeling that effect, that Snapchat is vulnerable as well. And also, by the way, TikTok is good. So, and by the way, fairness to Instagram and Facebook, so is Reels. Anyway, I don't want to talk about social media because then we'll end up talking about Elon Musk, and that will use up the rest of the half hour. We won't be talking about XR. Let me just say, by the way, on the topic of Elon Musk, oh my God, and he's saying it's going to be good for democracy. That is terrifying because the opposite is true.
Just went down the rabbit hole, Charlie, as much as you tried.
Okay, let's move on. Let's stick with TikTok because, they haven't done much with Pico since buying it last year for $900 million. Pico has sort of stayed the course as a kind of staid business brand, VR for training here in the West. And in China, it is a popular, I would say, VR headset among many. Because the Chinese market is pretty competitive. We don't know a whole lot about it, or I don't. But they decided to bring the Pico Neo 3 to consumer markets in the West and in the United States. It's not going to have as big an app store, but they're aiming for that space in between gamers and productivity.
And it's not a subsidized costing device, right? So it's going to be close to $1,000 to buy it, right?
Yeah,
so
that's a key point. I mean, everyone in the West, at least, has fled the consumer VR market because of Facebook's loss leader pricing. You can't compete with that. They're subsidized pricing. So it's sort of a bold move to move in there.
I mean, obviously they're feeling like they can afford it because
Yeah.
consumer marketing, even if you're only looking for a number 3 spot after Sony and Meta, is still incredibly expensive.
Mhm. They're actually going in the opposite direction now that I think about it, because a lot of players that competed with Oculus or now Meta um, have shifted into enterprise, right? Like HTC.
Right.
And so now you have Pico, which was largely serving enterprise, at least in Western markets, now moving into consumer. And of course, they had a consumer play in China and throughout Asia. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see if they're able to grab some market share there, because it's just dominated by Sony and Meta in the West, at least.
Let's hit the rest of the stories in sort of a speed round here, and I'll just go to you guys with stories for the color. How's that?
Sounds good.
All right, so Ted, we're starting with Meta begins to monetize in-world sales from its creators.
Yeah,
What's your take
maybe.
on this? There's been a big backlash because people love it when Meta does things that can be roundly criticized, as
Yes.
this certainly was.
Well, and like multiple sides of the equation. I think
Yep.
the first argument is maybe a little too early to remove the subsidization strategy of keep building the market, keep cultivating, keep bringing people into their walled garden, and then slowly, once you're fully committed, once you're fully pregnant with them, and you've got to, that's where your economy is, then they start taking their profit layers.
Yeah, they're doing it with hardware. Why not here, right?
Right, right. And they have been for many years, right, across many sectors.
Yeah.
So, and it's a pretty healthy chunk, but I think there's pressure from the board on, if you're going to make this pivot to this new form of your company, how are you going to make money with this new form of your company? And this is potentially one way that they're at least putting themselves out there, at least in the public eye, saying, no, this is going to be a profit venture for us.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. They need to start at least showing something there. But this goes back to this sort of TikTok and Snap move of crowdsourcing the development of experiences, because otherwise you show up there and just nothing's happening.
Right, right. And there is a lot of this nothing's happening. This is a bigger, sort of broader challenge with technology overtaking the organic growth of a sector, right? And because technology is so easy to, because over the last 40, 50 years on it, we now have so many of these virtual land platforms and these virtual NFT, situations and all these things. And largely, ghost towns for a lot of them, right? Because unless you can market it and really get awareness for it in a continual fashion, which is really hard to do. Like Charlie makes the point about TikTok being so successful because it's got a continual draw point, right? And Facebook for many generations, continual draw point, but fading away. And that's why they buy other companies and pivot around. So you're in an interesting time where technology makes things really easy to prop up, to get going. And you end up with a lot of stuff, right?
Yeah. Well, it isn't like one of the is that land value is based on scarcity.
Right. When that's the metaphor that they're trying to hold in some of these virtual land platforms. But to Charlie's point, it may not hold for very long.
Yeah, and it's not
people
scarce.
Don't really want that metaphor in their virtual worlds, right? They just want to click on the icon and go there. They don't.
Yeah, and it's not scarce if there's such saturation. There's so many of them and no one's there.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Exactly. So, Mike, here's something from Enterprise VR trading platform Remio, raising $4.5 million, and they're going after that training and collaboration space. They claim several marquee customers, but it seems like this space has been struggling.
Yeah, and this is sort of the like meat and potatoes of the spatial spectrum. I mean, it's not as sexy as talking about a lot of the consumer stuff, but enterprise training has a real endpoint. It has real ROI. You have a few players there like Striver that have sort of been around for a while and are really, I think, nailing it. I don't know a lot about this company before I heard about this funding, so I still have to sort of dig into this. But
they gamify training and teaching. So it's not, it looks a little bit like Mozilla Hubs. So it's not very sophisticated visually, but they have a lot of, team games.
Sure.
Don't require you to be a gamer.
So they have like a
blindfolded game where you're trying to keep somebody walking forward but not falling off the edge. to
Yeah.
use one example. So
It's an interesting approach. We know that there's efficacy in VR training in terms of the memory recall, in terms of the brain encoding of just highly immersive experiences, works great in retail. So I think there's a lot of growth still there to be had because we know it has efficacy, but its actual penetration is still so low among all of the different types of verticals and organizations that could be using this.
So Ted, last story, and
Yep.
there were a bunch more in the column this week, but Somnimum Space. So this is one of those virtual land companies that has been very successful in creating its own currency. They're small, but they seem to be building a strong economy.
Yeah.
So and they have a lot of money as a result of selling the crypto. Or creating.
I was going to say there's a crypto play to this, which is
Mana,
part of
right? It's Mana. So they're using Mana to create an AI which would track you inside of Somnimum Space, and slowly over time, even if you are deceased, use that tracking data to create a more and more realistic representation of who you were. So that your grandchildren can visit you, or your great grandchildren, or other ancestors, and you will have evolved following death.
Yes. So it does feel like there's a B movie in the works there, right? And it feels like that movie's been done a few times around the idea of this sort of technological, like removing everything of you and putting it into a virtual portal, and then of course it can come back to haunt and do all kinds of other terrible things in the world. So there's your B movie. I guess in one perspective, it's a natural evolution of what we do with our media silos that we create. All our pictures that we keep online these days, depending on what platform you use, and it's sort of a repository of your life. And then all the people that are constantly sort of posting their moments in life on their various social media platforms of choice.
In that context, not crazy.
Right. No, it's not crazy. I mean, it really isn't crazy because it's already happening. This is just a little more sophisticated construct of that, and a group trying to monetize upon that in some fashion.
Whatever happened to freezing yourself?
I think this is a better idea, actually, because when you're unfrozen, you're still old.
So who's the company? I think it was 8i, that sort of photogrammetry capture studio. They did something along these lines where it was just basically to
now
make
they run around capturing actors on the sets of movies.
Yeah.
In case they die before the movie is finished.
Right.
So anyway, any parting thoughts on where we are? We're almost in the middle of the year, Mike. What can we expect for the balance of this year? In terms of the progression of XR.
So I think that you guys hit the nail on the head earlier when you were talking about the broader fundamental sort of shift towards things that are streaming, software, atoms, not bits. One of the things that occurred to me when I was talking about
it's
Snap,
not atoms.
Yeah, right. So Snap, the creator platforms, when you look at the tremendous success from a sort of business model standpoint of, Meta, Snapchat, a lot of these companies, they essentially act like media companies. They get all the advantages and margins of media companies, but without one of the biggest cost components of media, which you guys well know, which is content, right? Content is king, but it's also damn expensive. So, they've been able to essentially crowdsource the creation of all of the content. Right. So I think that, especially right now when you're seeing things like supply chain issues, we're just going to see a lot more. And this isn't probably a new concept now that I'm hearing myself saying it. It's just the old software is eating the world. But I think we're going to continue to see that.
Well, YouTube was the originator of that, right? Like flipping the model on its head and not even knowing that they were going to do it. And that's my point, which I sort of bring up on this podcast a lot, is that the organic sort of layers of how something gets built versus the let's build a startup to try and achieve this objective are always more powerful when it's organic.
I think it's one of those things. It's one of those things, right, where we're totally right, but it's going to take a really long time. And there are going to be a lot of twists and turns along the journey. When we were thinking about, the internet in 1995, we were not thinking about Google. And so we're kind of in that moment, right? We're thinking about spatial computing in 2022, but in 2032, we're going to look back and say, we didn't see this, we didn't see that. Yes, we'll be at this future point, but I think we'll see some big companies stumble and some new companies arrive. My issue there is that those big companies probably will buy them. It will be almost impossible for them, for a new Instagram to become its own company. Now that's where regulation comes in, and there may be in the future some movement to force the companies to divest so that they're less powerful, and in a way, new public companies, new Googles can arise. But
Well,
that's what we have
another-
this morning as a show. It's 8:35. Great to see you, gentlemen. And we'll see everybody again next Friday here at This Week in XR. And let me just say, I forgot to thank our sponsor, Verbella. It was great having Alex Howland on the show last week. And thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thanks, guys.